talk about what it might mean to believe that we have been created as the people of God for a time such as this. Looking at the world around us in terms of belief, in terms of ethics, and today in terms of practice. Now, I say the same thing at the beginning of this sermon that I've said the last 2 weeks, that you may not see the world the way I do, and that's okay. This comes out of the way I see the world. And out of that understanding of the way the world is, beginning next week, we're going to talk about what it might mean for the church to be an alternate voice to what the world does, what the world says, how the world lives in this culture that we find ourselves caught up in. I want to talk today about the world around us in terms of the way I see the world practicing what it means to be in relationship. And I want to start first of all with a story. Now, many of you have probably heard this story before. Let me be clear, as far as I know, it is not true. Okay? I've never met the two people that theoretically were involved. So it may be apocryphal at best, but I think it says something about the world that we live in. Seems that John got up one morning early and had a day before him with absolutely nothing to do. So he called his good buddy Bill and he said, "Bill, I got nothing to do today. If you've got nothing to do today, why don't we go hunting?" Bill checked his calendar and said, "I don't have anything to do. Sounds like a good idea." So they met at the appropriate time and took off to do a little squirrel hunting back in the woods. And they'd been hunting about an hour, and just, it was one of those things, kind of like me and fishing. Really didn't make any difference whether they were getting anything. It was the fellowship and the fact that they were together and they were friends and they had this opportunity to share time. And all of a sudden, from beside the path that they happened to be on through the woods, they heard crashing through the underbrush a giant bear. And they looked at each other, and both of them had the same thought. They began running away from the bear as fast as they could. And all of a sudden, in the midst of the flight, John, who's running right next to Bill, reaches out with his foot and he trips him. And Bill said, "What are you doing?" And John said, "You understand, I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than you." Now, I think that says something about the world we live in, folks. That somehow one of the things that the culture that we live in has done is created a world where we have built towers. Let me explain what I mean by that. A tower obviously is designed to get you higher than your surroundings. And I really believe we live in a world where we have created a culture where it is about being better than somebody else. Being better than, higher than, more powerful than, smarter than, however you want to say it, the person next to you. And that's true not just in our relationships with each other. It's true in the way we market almost everything that gets sold in the world today. I've been amazed as I look at advertisements for different products that very seldom does the advertisement tell me anything about the product. Have you noticed that? All it does is tell me that they're better than somebody else. If you go out to buy a car or a truck, very seldom will they tell you about the car. And so what they tell you about is how they rate compared to everybody else in somebody's rating system. So that the world we live in is all about building towers so that we can compare ourselves to others. We do that with products. We do that with the things that we participate in. I opened up the paper yesterday morning, I confess, only to check to see what time certain football games were going to be on, which meant, of course, that I was on the sports page. You do understand that on the sports page yesterday, there was an entire page of the paper in very small print designed to do one thing, to tell me how my team's ranked in relation to every other team. Now, I enjoy athletics as much as the next person. But I've often wondered what would happen if the world reverted to the way the baseball league was for my grandson this summer, where they played X number of innings with X number of outs, and everybody got to bat and nobody kept score. And when they went home, they'd had a really good time, as John and Bill did before the Bears showed up. They'd had a really good time, and they'd learned some important skills, not only about baseball, but about how to get along. And it wasn't about who was better and who was worse. Now, it may not be a problem when you're talking about 6-year-olds playing baseball. But when the issue of building towers and who's better and who's worse and who's number one and who's not and who's more powerful and who isn't begins to affect the way adults relate to each other, then I think what happens is that we end up with the very thing that our first hymn spoke against. That it's always about making sure that we're a little higher on the rung than somebody else. And so what we do is, you see, we set up this status thing, when God would remind us that we are all the same. And indeed, when Jesus is asked by his followers, as recorded in the gospel this morning, for the 2 great commandments, neither one of them has anything to do with being better than or ranking higher than somebody else. The 2 great commandments are to love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Second story that I think has something to do with the way the world behaves, the practice of the world today, is that we're not only about building towers that elevate us above others, that create this I'm better than you, or my group is better than you, or my product is better than you, but we're also really good about building walls. A number of years ago, some of you remember there was that Sunday morning in June when you got a brand new preacher. His name was Ted Inman. Y'all remember Ted? Great guy. Ted's first Sunday here was my first Sunday at St. Mark's, where I followed Ted. That was a neat thing, to follow somebody with those gifts and those graces. And the amazing thing was, when church was over and people were coming out, nobody said to me, how have you experienced the church? They all wanted to know how I had experienced the neighborhood. Had I had a chance to drive around and familiarize myself with things yet? And I said, yes, I did. As a matter of fact, I noticed that 6 blocks down the street is a country club. And one of them, who just happened to be a member there, I didn't know that at the time, or I probably wouldn't have said what I said, asked me, are you going to join it? And I said, no, I don't think so. As I drove by, I noticed that the unique thing about this particular country club was that they had a fence all the way around the boundary. Not just a fence, folks. On top of the fence was barbed wire. And I said, you know what I'll bet? I'll bet they didn't put that fence up to keep the golf balls in. I'll bet they put that fence up to keep people like me out. See, one of the things that we do in our culture that the world does in terms of the way we behave is we're really good at building fences. We're really good at creating ways to keep people out rather than welcome people into a community of faith. And we do that in our communities. Sometimes we do that in our families. Unfortunately, sometimes we do that in our churches. Countries do that. That somehow what we've done, you see, is we've staked out a place that is ours and then tried to decide who it is that we're going to let in and who it is that we're going to keep out. And I think that's unfortunate, because in some ways, the minute you build a wall that keeps somebody else out, what you've done is acted counter to those 2 great commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. It's an amazing, amazing thing. That somehow or another, you see, the world is about building, and building isn't a bad thing, but it's about building towers and walls. Towers that separate us from others, and walls that keep them out of the places that we are. Maybe because they're different, maybe because we're afraid of them, maybe because we're just too busy to deal with them, but whatever it is. And I think that's true culturally. Not just in this country, not just in this community, but globally. Globally, we are about measuring ourselves against others and then working so that we can be better than. Globally, we are about building walls that keep people out rather than bridges that invite people in. I think both of those go contrary to the gospel reading this morning about loving God and loving neighbor. In the first letter that was written to the church at Thessalonica, there is the injunction this morning, if you listen to that scripture, to love folks. And the author of 1 Thessalonians actually commends the people for the good job they do loving each other. But the amazing thing about that is that he talks about that as work. The author of 1 Thessalonians doesn't say that loving God and loving neighbor just comes natural. He understood that for those people who were pretty good at it, and for those of us who follow in the footsteps of those in Thessalonica, that it's real work to resist building towers. It takes great effort to keep from building walls, sometimes more effort than it does to build the wall itself. He commends to them the necessity to do the work of God. The work of God, which is loving God and loving neighbor as we love ourselves. So we've spent 3 weeks now talking about church and the way I believe the world operates primarily. The ethical system that seems to guide the world, and now the practice, the behavior of the world. Starting next week, we're going to look at maybe an alternative voice that you and I, as the Church of Jesus Christ, are called to share with the world. What might it look like if we said, we're going to separate ourselves from the way the world believes and acts and offer an alternative? The alternative that is rooted in the gospel and founded in the good news of Jesus Christ. So that the church creative becomes the hands and the feet of the voice of God as God attempts to redeem this creation that you and I live in. So I hope you come back the next few weeks. We're going to continue to deal with this. And in the meantime, I hope God keeps me from spending my time and my effort building the towers that I build and the walls that I build that are so much the way the world works. Amen. We would invite our ushers to come forward.